Another 3 minutes. I'm sorry to have missed our class last week, uh, and I would like to begin today's class by making 3 sets of remarks. All of them very schematic, but offered with the intention of sharpening our debate about points that are fundamental to our discussion. So the first set of remarks concerns the nature and the crisis of the regime in the North. Actually, let me not begin there. I'm going to begin with something else. I'm going to begin with the New Deal. First set of remarks is going to concern the New Deal, which is the episode in American history on which the progressives most lavish their admiration. Is it not? And regard as the exemplary instance of progressive reform in the United States. And these remarks are offered in the spirit of questioning this progressive orthodoxy in this particular historical application. The New Deal lasted a long time, what you could call the New Long Deal, from Roosevelt's coming to power at the beginning of 1933 to the aftermath of his death after the end of the Second World War. And we can divide it into 4 periods. The first period was from his accession to power to the middle of 1934. It was the period of the early institutional experimentalism. The second period was from the middle of 34 to the Second World War. The third period was the period of the war and the war economy, and the fourth period was the aftermath. Roosevelt presented himself as a radical experimentalist, and no one can doubt the sincerity of his experimentalist convictions. He spoke with all sorts of people, with the representatives of all the currents of opinion that existed in the country at that time, and he genuinely sought to find a way. He said he'd try anything, and he did try almost everything that came to his attention. But his experience also illustrates the way in which even great leaders are in the end the victims of the ideas available in their time. So although his experimentalism was sincere, it was not as radical as it should have been. In this early period, there were 2 main themes to the experimentalism. The first theme was the restabilization of the American economy in the wake of the terrible crash that had happened before he came to power. And the central theme of that restabilization was what in today's vocabulary we would describe as corporatism. Managed competition, orchestrated deals between big business and organized labor, orchestrated by the federal government. Competition, rather than being radicalized, was often suppressed by price supports, by arrangements policing the ferocity of competition, and all intended in the spirit of restabilizing the economy. The second theme of the early experimentalism was the deployment of government, of the national government, as an employer of last resort in the context of the Depression. Work teams hired actually by the state, especially in the context of a regionalist national development strategy, illustrated, for example, by the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, which was seen by many as the signature program of the New Deal. So restabilization of the economy rather than democratization of the market order. The market order was accepted in its fundamental lineaments. There was no attempt to change the property regime. Then, starting in 1934, the focus of the New Deal narrowed, and The National Recovery Administration was declared unconstitutional and abandoned by Roosevelt even before it was declared unconstitutional. And the focus of the New Deal project began to provide antidotes to economic insecurity, especially insecurity of labor. And the signature program of those days was the Social Security program, complemented by a series of antidotes to the fragility of banks, the risk of bank runs, which was economic insecurity. And this focus on insecurity prefigured what would later become the main focus of European social democracy and social liberalism, which is to provide a series of occasions for decommodifying basic social needs. In other words, for saying that instead of being susceptible to the market and to market instabilities, they would be guaranteed by the state and taken out of the market. The institutional experimentalism remained in one area, especially the housing market, through the creation of the governmentally sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, parallel to the government, para-state organizations, which later, it turned out, became the main devices for the deepening of the capital market in the United States. And in that way, in that oblique way, the darlings of high finance, because high finance in the later decades depended on this vast capital market opened up by the governmentally sponsored enterprises. Then the third stage of the New Deal was the war economy, a remarkable interval in American history, as we mentioned before. In 4 years, the GDP of the United States doubled. The logic of the war economy lay in the combination of two sets of arrangements or initiatives. On the one hand, massive mobilization of physical, human, financial, and economic resources. The total volume of military procurements in the first 6 months of 1942 was greater than the total GDP of the United States in 1941. And radical institutional experimentalism. It wasn't just massive mobilization of resources. The mobilization of resources was combined with a willingness to try out arrangements that were foreign to the sacrosanct American economic ideology. It's as if the Americans took off this mask of devotion to the free market dogma, which they seemed to have embraced previously, and when necessity called, they did whatever was necessary to make the economy work. The whole economy was managed by a fluid coordination between the federal government and the big businesses in the country. The small businesses were cast in a secondary role. There was an attempt to create a role for them through the Small War Plants Act of 1942, but they were consigned to a secondary position. So it was a fluid partnership between the federal government and the big businesses, which retained and even aggravated the oligopolistic character of the economy, but produced tremendous economic results. Astonishing. Remember that the top rate of the federal income tax in the United States during the Second World War rose to over 90%, which is an astonishing fact for Americans who are alive today. And then, after the war economy, after the war, the example of the war economy, rather than being treated as a guide to a future project of the peacetime economy, was quarantined as if it were limited to its special circumstances. And no attempt was ever made in the United States then or now or later to think of the potential of this example of a war economy without a war as a guide to what a progressive political economic project might be. So then, in those closing decades of the 20th century, and in the run-up to the financial crisis of 2008, there were a series of negative dynamics in the United States. Increasing inequality of wealth and income, disassociation from communitarian bonds, erosion of social capital, and disengagement from politics, lower levels of political participation. A series of declining moves. And of course, the United States was run as on the basis of consumption-led economic growth. Now, right there's a contradiction. How could there be consumption-led economic growth without deepening of purchasing power, democratization of purchasing power? There was a paradoxical development. The paradox is explained because during this period, the United States became a kind of fake credit democracy rather than the property-owning democracy that Americans had projected earlier in their history. And the contradiction between economic inequality and consumption-led growth was managed in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. So what is the fundamental lesson that I suggest we derive from this example of the New Deal? Namely, that the New Deal is not a good example for the American progressives today because it had no genuine productivist project other than the project of the war economy, which is fabulous but very specific in its orientation. It had only a restabilization project, a project to bring the economy back to its feet rather than to use the crisis as an occasion to democratize the economy. So it was limited by the preference for restabilization over democratization and the preference for the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity over the preference for economic empowerment. And in those respects, it is not a model for the progressives today, is my polemical claim. Now I come to the second set of remarks about the regime in the North in the period between independence and the Civil War. As John has emphasized many times now in our argument, the regime in the North was a regime of artisans. It was an artisanal economy. What we could call to me a property-owning democracy, which the vast majority of white men who were not slaves worked for themselves. They were self-employed rather than working for another white man.
And in the North, that included African Americans.
Yes. Yeah. And so everyone who was not a slave was basically a self-employed petty proprietor, with the exceptions naturally. But that was the general character of the regime. Now, why did this regime come undone? Why did it come up stuck? The immediate occasion was the Civil War that led to the subversion of this property-owning democratic regime in the North. But the deeper limitation was that the liberals and socialists who defended this model of self-employment and free labor were unable to show how it could be reconciled with the aggregation of resources at scale. They had no theory of how, through some form of cooperation, this radical economic decentralization could be accommodated to the relentless imperative of aggregation of resources at scale. So at the end of the 19th century, those who appear on the horizon are J.P. Morgan, the banks, the corporations saying, we can do it. We can do it through the use of big money and economic concentration. And then the dream of petty commodity production was given up in little steps. And wage labor was naturalized toward the end of the 19th century as the predominant form of free labor, which it had never been accepted to be in earlier decades by people like Abraham Lincoln or John Stuart Mill, not to mention Karl Marx. So that's my second set of remarks. Now I want to make a third set of remarks regarding the large theme of economic inequality and the relation of economic inequality to the government and to public spending, which is in the background of these conversations that we're having now, engaging the work of Michael Lind and others. So I want to make these remarks by presenting three theses about inequality in relation to public spending in government. And these theses are in hierarchical order, that is. The first thesis applies first. The second thesis is ancillary to the first thesis, and the third thesis is ancillary to the second. The first thesis is that the fundamental constraint on economic equality or inequality has to do with the structure, with the economic structure, in particular the property regime and the economic institutions. With the economic structure influencing what you could call the primary distribution of economic advantage and opportunity, as opposed to the corrected redistribution. That is, the corrected redistribution is the one that comes later when you say, this is what the market has wrought. Now we come after the fact through progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements, and we undo the inequalities that the market has produced. The basic idea is that we can undo it to a very limited extent, but only to a very limited extent. We can't have an economic order based on a certain set of economic institutions and incentives and come later and say it doesn't count. We now want another one, because the other one either will not be for real or it will begin to destabilize the established economic order. We can't have it and not have it at the same time, which is the premise of the redistributivist thesis. So everything that influences the primary distribution of economic opportunities and capabilities, economic and educational opportunities and capabilities, is what matters first. And everything else is relatively secondary. Now we could say, this is the example of European social democracy, which came later, and on the basis of a high level of a high tax take, then funded a series of social and economic rights, decommodifying basic economic needs. And then social liberalism, which in some sense is the hegemonic project of today, is the flexibilized or liberalized version of historical social democracy, responding to the call to synthesize the economic flexibility of the Americans with the social protection of the Europeans. The second principle in this hierarchical ranking is that with respect to the budget, taking the budget on both its revenue-raising side and its spending side, what matters most is not the progressive profile of taxation. What matters most is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. And this claim then elucidates what you could consider the greatest enigma in comparative taxation in the contemporary world among the advanced societies. The greatest enigma is that the country that of the North Atlantic countries is by far the most unequal, the United States, gives pride of place to the progressive taxation of personal income. And the European societies, which are far more egalitarian, give pride of place to the avowedly regressive taxation of consumption, typically through the device of a comprehensive flat rate value-added tax, or a functional equivalent to it in some European countries like France. How are we to explain this paradox? The paradox can be explained in the following way. With respect to taxation, what matters most is not the progressive profile of taxation. What matters most is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. All the European social democracies, or their social liberal aftermath, take in at least 10% more of GDP than the United States. And then they spend it redistributively. So they spend, they make up in how they use that tax take for the regressive effects of taxation on the revenue-raising side. And there's a reason, there's a logic to this, which is the following. The comprehensive flat rate value tax, in principle, conceptually, is the tax that is most neutral with respect to the system of relative prices. So it makes it possible to maximize the tax take, but to minimize the economic trauma of taxation. And that's why the European societies are able to take in so much more in tax with no greater level of stress on the established economic arrangements and incentives.
And why didn't the United States borrow from
Why?
or experiment?
Yes, why? So it's interesting because I think the American progressives, at least the American progressive leaders who have studied this matter in economics and law, understand this, that the egalitarian effect of progressive taxation is relatively modest. They understand it.
Right.
But they are unwilling to face the dialectical subtleties of the public discussion and to explain to their voter base how regressive taxation can be in the service of progressive results. It seems that they prefer progressive pieties to transformative effects. They know, or they should know, that progressive taxes are not what they seem to be, but they're unwilling to enter into this territory, which is too dangerous. So at election time, the American progressive politicians all present themselves as the friends of progressive taxation. Even though they know or should know that they don't produce the results they're supposed to produce. In particular, the devotion to the income tax is mysterious because the income tax is a confused and blunt instrument. Throughout the world, rich people don't pay income tax on the whole. The income tax is primarily, functionally, a tax on the salaries, on the wages of the so-called middle class. That's what it is in effect. And so all the movement, all the theatrical movements in favor of the income tax are not sincere and reveal on the part of the progressive taxation, of the progressive politicians, a failure of leadership, a failure to execute the pedagogic responsibility of public office and to explain to the people what things really are. And it's not as if they didn't know. I'm sure that they know.
They're afraid of losing their votes.
The role of their position in politics on this matter is to show to the people whose side they're on.
Yes, yeah.
And that seems to be more important than explaining what works and how it works. Now we come to the third principle in the hierarchy. So the first principle is structure counts more than compensatory redistribution. Compensatory retrospective redistribution through taxation and through public spending is subordinate to structural change. Structural change is what really matters in the long run. But then the second principle is that with respect to progressive taxation and public spending, with respect to the budget, on both its revenue-raising side and its spending side, what matters most is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it's spent. What matters less is the progressive profile of taxation. Now we come to the third principle. That doesn't matter that once you have reformed the tax system and the system of public spending, you can't give a role to direct redistributive taxes. And the two most consequential forms of direct redistributive taxation hit two different targets. One target is the exercise of economic power. And now, the best way to hit the exercise of economic power, failing a consequential change in the structure of the property regime, which comes under the rubric of structural change, is to do so at the moment of death through the taxation of the hereditary transmission of property and its anticipation and gifts inter vivos. That's the most efficient way to do it. Then you have to tolerate radical inequality of income while the rich are still alive. But you can take it away from them when they die.
Right.
Then the second form...
In theory.
Yes, I say you can.
Right,
You can, not political possibility, but economic possibility. The second target of progressive taxation is the hierarchy of standards of living, which is determined by what individuals spend on themselves. And by far the best way to hit that target is through an individualized tax on consumption. Once you've changed the focus of the tax system by following the European example of privileging the neutral tax, value-added tax, which basically is, it's like a little device, a mouse, taking away a constant part of the transformation of every input into an output. Conceptually, though it's rarely designed to be completely neutral, if it is designed to be neutral, or to the extent that it's designed to be neutral, it's absolutely impartial to relative prices. For every transformation of an input into an output, for every aggregation of value in the process of production and circulation, it takes the same constant amount as a percentage. So in principle, it can be absolutely neutral. So the Europeans are able to do this, and their electorates have totally accepted the results. So no right-wing party in Europe in power has ever obtained a substantial reduction of the tax take or ever won power on the basis of proposing such a reduction. So the European electorates, independently of whether they're conservative or progressive, value this social contract. They say, we'll pay this, and in return, you will render our health and education secure against the instabilities of the market and against the ravages of economic inequality. So it's become part of the background, the shared assumption of European politics. So what can we do then? We can have an individualized tax on consumption. The name for it in the technical literature is the Kaldor tax, K-A-L-D-O-R. Nicholas Kaldor was a disciple of Keynes, and in 1952 he published a book called An Expenditure Tax, which was the first theoretical formulation of this tax. The tax is very simple to understand. The tax hits the difference between the total income of the individual, returns to capital, and returns to labor all together. And the invested saving of the individual. That difference is what the individual spends on himself and is then the economic basis of the hierarchy of the standards of living. So the tax then hits that difference. And it can be designed in such a way that those who earn very little pay nothing, or they receive something. That's what the Americans call the negative income tax. Then as their income goes up, the tax rate rises steeply, and now comes one of the charms of the Kaldor tax, which is the top rate is not 100%. The top rate can be multiples of 100%, because you can say, beyond a certain level of luxury living, for every dollar that you spend on yourself, you have to pay $4 to the state. So there's no limit. The limit is political audacity and political will. This tax has no difficulties of technical administration other than the difficulties of the income tax. It's the same. So the sky's the limit as far as implementation go. If the progressives were sincere in their devotion to progressive taxation, this is the tax that they would propose, right? Because it doesn't hit the hierarchy of standards of living, because the individual, if he's greedy, if he wants to watch over his gold, he can let it accumulate, and then we can hit him when he dies, or by some other device. But this is the tax which would fix the most fundamental inequality in these societies, which is the inequality of standards of living. After all, if an individual is earning vast resources and accumulating them, but not spending them on himself, the only problem lies in economic power. And we have to have other instruments for dealing with that. We shouldn't have put at the center of the tax system a tax which combines these two targets and hits neither of them squarely or coherently, and can easily be evaded by the rich. So that's what I want to say by way of my third set of remarks. And the spirit of the third set of remarks is to say, inequality of economic power and of consumption possibilities is a terrible feature of these societies, a formidable feature, but it's not a difficult one to hit. It's an easy one to hit, given political will and given political power. But its difficulty does not lie in any technical complexity.
And why haven't politicians then?
Because they don't really want it.
No.
They're ambivalent in their will and confused. And what is notable, and this was my pedagogic theme from before, is that they don't seem to feel they have the imperative to explain this to the people, which is one of the fundamental responsibilities of a leader in a democratic society. So that's all I wanted to say. Yes?
I don't remember what theorist put it like this, but I've heard this general critique of democratic politics and redistribution as something like, if you're going to design a democratic system, if you're a politician, you can either appeal to like the top 25%, like a class, right? Think of like, how much money a person makes. Like if you divide it up into quartiles.
Yes.
The politicians would likely either tailor their policies to appeal to the top 25% of earners, because those are people who are like insiders and elites. They're most likely to have influence. Or into the middle 50%, because they represent a democratic majority. But what you would unlikely see is policies directed to the bottom 25%, because they neither have political influence nor do they have a democratic majority. And so I wonder, is it really a problem of like will? Like the politicians just don't have enough verbal acuity, they don't have enough, backbone or spine? Or is it just like a structural problem of democratic politics that you're just unlikely to see genuine radical transformation towards the bottom 25% of earners just by the structure of how you're likely to be successful?
But the remarks I just made about inequality in the budget weren't particularly directed to the bottom 25%. They were directed just to the majority in a common sense sense. So it is true that if you now contrast the New Deal to what came later in the United States, Roosevelt focused on the majority of the country. He didn't focus on an insular minority. So if you contrast Roosevelt's Social Security to Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, Johnson made the mistake of focusing on the poor as an insular minority. And the Europeans had always rejected that because they had understood that that's what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't separate out the needy group and take them as the object of public charity. You should say this is what the whole country needs, and everyone gets it. And that's how you go to the top. So I don't think that the argument in the way in which I presented is vulnerable to the kind of criticism that you're enunciating now. But surely there are other objections to this route that I'm proposing.
Right. I mean, and what you sketched out, I mean, there's a long tradition of that. There's a long tradition of the United States not requiring taxes on a basic level for everyone. And so it becomes harder and harder over the years for a lot of Americans. They say, I'm proudly not European.
Well, what I'm saying is not specifically couched in the discourse of European social democracy.
Right.
So just to make clear my position, if I were designing from scratch a system for capital, I would say the ideal is that the major productive resources of society be placed in independent funds
Okay,
Right.
right,
and that they don't belong to anyone.
right.
So there's capital, but there are no capitalists.
Right.
And these funds then auction off the capital resources of society to whoever can assure the society the highest rate of return,
Right.
which is a neutral conception,
Right.
right? And of course, there are 1,000 technical difficulties of how you would design these funds,
Right.
what the ratios of risk and return, the time horizons are,
Right.
how people would credential themselves as bidders in these auctions,
Mhm.
and so forth.
Right.
But that's all relatively secondary to the basic conception. Now, the curiosity is that orthodox finance theory says that this auction off of capital
Right.
to its most efficient users is what already happens,
Right.
because it says that a perfectly competitive finance market, if there is no flaw in competition or no asymmetry of information, already auctions off capital to its most efficient users. So, for example, if someone objects to the so-called spontaneous privatization in Russia, by which the Russian oligarchs seize the assets
Right.
of the Soviet states,
Right.
they will say, these finance theorists, don't worry, it doesn't matter who gets them initially, because they're going to end up in the hands of the most efficient users anyway. So what my thought experiment is doing is it's simply imposing as a decree that what the system imagined by finance theory says actually happens. Don't wait to see if their promise is kept. Keep their promise now. But then the question is, what do you do in one of these societies, like the existing market societies, where there are these variations? Now, the fundamental objection to social democracy, in my view, is that it has a system of havens, of safeguards, but it's just half of a progressive project, because that's the half about the havens, without the other half about the storm. And the fundamental imperative in public life is not just to produce this humanization of the economic order. It's to ensure that there will be a storm of innovation, of conflict, of contradiction, of disruption. And the force that most credibly embodies the cause of novelty and creation and constructive energy will command the agenda in any society sooner or later. So that's the side one should take. One should take the side of the future. Yes.
Is there any American politician who has articulated something that gets close to what your ideal is that you've laid out for us? Is there anyone that you would say, okay, they're getting there, or they're, yeah.
Well, I hesitate now.
Are you referring to today or just historically, or both?
Professor Unger can
Yep.
choose which way he wants to answer it, but maybe both, or is that greedy of me?
Well, so there's a problem, I think, in John's question obliquely raises this problem, in that the 19th century version of liberalism and socialism was closer to the spirit of what I'm saying than the contemporary version. Because the 19th century conception of the liberals and of the socialists, what John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx shared in common was the idea that the aim is not to humanize society, which is what decommodification in short. The aim is to divinize humanity. And that the objective of the progressives ought to be to raise the ordinary human life to a higher level of scope, intensity, of capability, to make us greater, bigger, not just to make us sweeter, although making us sweeter would be a considerable achievement. And that's what this is about. And for that reason, not just for practical economic reasons, we want the market order to be stormy. We want contradiction. We want conflict. We want disruption. We want innovation. And we don't want just to transform the population into a series of permanent pensioners. And that's a view which historically, that's a rhetoric which historically comes more easily to the right than to the left. But so what happens in these societies is that the left has mainly a distributivist discourse. So one of the guests to this class in an earlier iteration was Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders comes here, he sits on one of his desks, and it's clear from the first words he spoke that what he thought was progress was for the United States to become like the Sweden in the 1970s. And I thought, well, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen anyway. But and I wouldn't want it to happen as a friend and admirer of the United States. So that's part of the background, in which the choices between a savage form of creation, which has all of these inequalities in, and this sweetening, the sugarcoating, translated into a logic of entitlements, in which the objective is safeguard. And one can translate this dispute that I'm imagining into something that's much more visceral about the logic of rights. So if I have a child and I say to the child, you have an unconditional place in my love, no matter who you become or what you do. Now that you have an unconditional place in my love, go out into the war world and raise a storm. That's what the state should do to the individual citizen. The state should say, you have this unconditional place, now go out and raise a storm. And I think, with regard to these discussions we're having in the United States, that this discourse, this message is more pleasing to an American ear than a message that says, just protect yourself. Wrap yourself up in 10 layers of protection, 5 of which will be provided by the state. And I think the message in democratic and Christian civilization should be unprotect yourself, not protect yourself. Unprotect yourself for the sake of a larger life. Yes.
So when you said the rhetoric, you were describing rhetoric that you believe comes more easily to the right.
This message about the storm has a right-wing sound to it.
Like raising a storm? The idea
Excuse
of
me?
raising a storm? Like, is it the idea of like going out and raising a storm that comes more easily? Is that what you're describing?
I think that so I criticize historical social democracy for offering a series of safeguards, right? And I say it's missing the other half. It's not enough to have the havens, we want the storm. And the storm doesn't happen spontaneously. The storm has to be arranged. So the theory of a democratized market order or the theory of a high-energy democracy are different institutional vehicles for arousing the storm. So what we want is a dialectic between security and fundamental human matters and a storm of innovation, which breaks the shell, right?
Mm.
This goes back to the Emersonian theme. So we're all dying in these mummies as we get older. A carapace of routine and silent surrender begins to form around each of us. So part of the way we can break the mummies from within by choosing to unprotect ourselves.
Right.
But the mummies can also be broken from the outside by a democracy that subjects us to challenge, to stress.
Right.
Stress and challenge are good, they're not bad, so long as our basic human needs are taken care of.
Well, that's well said.
So I think, for example, this discussion of taxation that I propose in the form of my 3 propositions, it's a very practical discussion. It's not about some airy-fairy theory. It's something tangible.
Right.
And we ought to be able to discuss it
Yeah.
in relation to the prevailing views. But each time there's a right-wing movement in the contemporary West, it becomes an excuse for an elite to advantage itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the radical democratic impulse is not associated with this discourse. And why not? Shouldn't it be? I mean, that's the question.
Is there room in the storm for standards or limitations of behavior? So not necessarily the individual level havens or safeguards, but sort of moral agreements that, you know, certain things are held in common and as priority.
Yes, I think so. So it's interesting the way you phrase it, because I think you pinpoint something deep about the nature of the discourse about fundamental rights. So what is a fundamental right? A fundamental right has the concept of a fundamental right has 2 parts to it. One is a method, and the second is the substance or the purpose. So the method is the method of entrenching something that is no longer vulnerable to the ups and downs of short-term politics. So you say, this that we regard as a sacrosanct human right will be proof against the storm. We'll tie our hands to the mast, to change the metaphor, in this respect. We'll take something out of the agenda of short-term politics for the sake of an expansion of the agenda of short-term politics. That's the method. And it can be realized through constitutional entrenchment, or even realized through some narrative or discourse. But this was the role of the narrative of natural rights in the West. Say, these are assigned to us by God, so they're not within the realm of human volition. So that's the method. And now comes the purpose. What's the purpose? The purpose is that we not abuse our guarantees, our safety, our sanctity, as an excuse to surrender. So one of the fundamental dimensions of being free, of freedom, as both an individual good and a collective good, as we say, to be free we must engage in a particular social world. No one is free in the forest, in the desert.
Right.
But the problem is that the price of engagement is normally surrender. And we don't want the price of engagement to be surrendered. We want to say, engage, but refuse to give the last word to the social order. Keep the last word for yourself. And we'll guarantee that. That's freedom. Freedom is to be able to be an insider and an outsider at the same time.
Right.
So that you can engage without surrendering.
Right.
So I would say that really there are these three dimensions or three domains of freedom that all underlay this question that you raised about the rights. So one dimension is the relation to the others. So Jean-Paul Sartre says the others are hell. Every human connection is a threat of subjugation. So what's freedom in the connection to another? Freedom is to be able to connect without being subjugated, without losing oneself. And we have a sense of that in intimate in life, in love. But what's the counterpart to love and life among strangers? The counterpart is cooperation. And cooperation then is the subject of conflict in history. What form of the market? What form of democracy? Those are the two simplified images of cooperation that we have. And both are institutionally indeterminate. So we have to have a struggle.
Right.
And the struggle fills history. Then the second domain is society. We have to engage, but we must not surrender. We have to engage without surrendering. We have to keep the last word for ourselves. We have to be able to participate and resist at the same time, and continue the resistance. That's the second domain of freedom. And the third domain of freedom is in our relation to ourselves. To be free, a person has to form a coherent personality.
Right.
The Greeks called it a character.
Right.
They said the character is destiny.
Right.
But the individual can't allow this sculpted version of himself to reify and to suck the life out of him.
Right.
Otherwise, it becomes the real thing and he becomes just a phantom. So we have to be able to form a coherent version of ourselves,
Right.
but at the same time to subvert it, disrupt it from within. And that's freedom. So that's what freedom is. Freedom is a series of contradictions.
Yeah.
And the task of the society is to make it easier for us to live out these contradictions.
Right. So an example would be that when you mention cooperation leads to conflict, cooperation can also lead to friendship.
Yes.
And that distinction is important. It's crucial.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we see, for example, these market orders are, what is a market? A market is a form of simplified cooperation with strangers
Yes.
that is
Yes.
probably unnecessary when there is high trust and impossible when there is low trust. So the doctrine of the social theorists like Max Weber or Simmel with respect to markets was that they had a moral presupposition. The moral presupposition was the generalization of a modicum of trust, of low trust among strangers, as opposed to radical contrast between the insiders and the outsiders of the group. Now, an interesting trait that we observe is that the advanced forms of production of economic organization typically heighten the level of discretionary autonomy and of reciprocal trust required and permitted of all participants in the process of production. So although ordinary Rust Belt industries, mass production, can be like infantry brigades, subject to command and control. The higher forms of economic organization, the knowledge economy, are experimental productive teams, typically associated with the transformation of the moral culture. So, for example, when people study the relative success of Silicon Valley compared to the relative failure of Route 128 in Boston, they say that one of the advantages of Silicon Valley is that there's a more extensive circulation of people, ideas, resources among the firms. So there's more of So there's an association, productive vanguardism, with the heightening of the level of trust, which shows that these moral, the economic phenomena are mixed up with moral phenomena.
Right.
So that's also some advantage that we have.
Yes.
So the societies that are able to have the storm can also have as part of the background this heightening of the level of reciprocal trust. So I think that those reflections then suggest a more complicated set of ideological alternatives than the ones that are present in the existing scene of politics, in which you have the defenders of Sweden 1970s version running against the Buccaneers.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
It's too crude.
Yeah.
Now, John, how would you associate this discussion we're having now with the discussion we began last week about the Gilded Age and the tycoons and
The tycoons and were ruthless, and so they would have completely repudiated what we've just been discussing. I mean, it was a period of in fact, the term was widely used of self-making, but that was defined only in terms of money and power. And
on the other hand, there was this philanthropic element.
the philanthropic element, but the philanthropy was a small percentage of Rockefellers and the huge billionaires at the time. They promoted their philanthropy verbally.
But some were more sincere than others.
Yes, some were.
Carnegie, for example.
Carnegie was probably the most comparatively benevolent, but Carnegie was. I mean, he was a strong man. He expected a very clear, narrow understanding of his workers and of money, and if you deviated or violated that, you became an enemy. So I mean, in a sense, as I said, he's a kind of strong man. So there wasn't a lot of flexibility, the other billionaires of that day were they.
Frick had his workers shot, right?
Yes. And I mentioned, that a number of strikes were seen as a form of desertion. And in fact, so I mentioned last week that in these new corporations, workers were exploited. When they tried to strike, that was seen as the equivalent of desertion, reflecting the war, and desertion in the war on both sides in theory could lead to, or the crime of desertion could lead to execution. And so a number of
and we have another one of these tyrants coming up, Ford, right?
Yes, and Ford is coming up next week, no, or the following week. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But they saw themselves as monarchs. They saw themselves as monarchs in a profound way. And that was totally different from the antebellum period, really through. I mean, within the during the war. I mean, part of Lincoln's virtues was his comparative humility. He sought out numerous different men and women, blacks and whites, and solicited their recommendations or requests. He was one of the most the open presidents that we've ever had in that sense.
And John, could you say something about the war economy?
Yeah, so the war economy, the war economy essentially creates the war economy destroys most of the artisanal economy.
You're talking about the Civil War,
Yeah, Civil War.
not the war economy of the 20th century.
Oh, the war economy of the 20th century was also true. I mean, in World War I, because the United States was not, they entered the war late. It did not have much of an effect, and it was Wilson's. I mean, a large most
Well, that's the
intellect.
First World War.
Pardon me.
The real war economy, I think, is the Second World War.
But the Second World War employed methods, and they included. We didn't mention this, but they included. Women for the first time, both as in the military, but also in the workplace. They were crucial in terms of obtaining jobs both in the military and outside in the workplace. And then after the war, it wasn't, that's when, after World War II, following the war, that's when this ideology of women being in the home and not working started to come and become common, which had never been the case before. There's a long history in the United States where women had their own own small businesses, or they worked with their husbands or children, and they were workers in multiple levels, and in many cases owned their own businesses. And in a lot of both in the war economy, the women were hugely influential both to the military and in terms of becoming economically comfortable.
And how is it that the American progressives came to accept the principle of a mercenary army, a paid army? This was under Nixon, right?
Yes, it was under Nixon. That's a great question. That's a great question. It was under Nixon.
I mean, the practical reason is fairly clear, that these military expeditions of the United States against the Barbary pirates and their successors were obviously hamstrung by the opposition to the elites to having their children go to these wars.
Yes.
So to get rid of this obstacle,
Right.
they then transform the fundamental nature of the army.
Yeah, they do. In World War II, almost all military took it upon themselves to enlist. They enlisted themselves, and it was seen as if you
Well, you
were
only have to go here to Memorial Hall and see who died.
yes.
Right?
I mean, the same with the Civil War had conscription because the Civil Wars, both sides started conscription because the death rates were so bad. Although a comparatively large number of Harvard men, and because Boston and Harvard was anti-slavery, they enlisted themselves. But both the North and the South ultimately implemented conscription. In fact, it led to riots, New York City draft riots. Was 25, 30 people were killed. There was also race involved at a number of. They were known as Copperhead Democrats. I think I mentioned this, meaning that Copperhead Democrats. In fact, McClellan would have probably won the election in 1864 had Sherman not taken Atlanta. And McClellan's platform, and the Copperhead Democratic platform, essentially was in bed with the South. The platform was end the war immediately with slavery intact. And the only question was, should we allow the rebel states to return into the Union or allow them to remain a separate sovereign nation? It was essentially a Southern platform. And McClellan almost certainly would have won had Sherman not taken Atlanta. I mean, he was well in terms of the polling then. Everyone thought he was going to win. So there was huge contestation and controversy because of that. A large number by 1863, the death rates were just astronomical, and so which required conscription.
Well, the abandonment of conscription seems to me to be one of the most vicious forms of subversion of Republican institutions.
Yes.
How can you have
That's exactly
a
right.
faction of the population of poor people
That's right.
paid by the other factions to defend them?
That's right.
The end of the Republic.
Yes, that's exactly right. And there's a long tradition of, so through the 20th century, especially after World War I and World War II, in the wake of World War II, most young men enlisted in the military. Even Harvard, Yale, but whether you were it can't come from a very wealthy family, it was a sense of pride and duty to serve the term in the military. And the vast majority of men did so. And many women did as well. It was part of one's identity as an American. And what destroyed that was Vietnam. And for all kinds of reasons. Vietnam was really the first living room war. So it's a war in which, all previous instances of war, at least in the United States, is that the home front did not literally see or have any details of what war is about, which is killing people. And in fact, it starts in the Civil War, where after the Battle of Antietam, which was the bloodiest battle, even more so than Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the war, and Harper's Weekly hired a photographer to photograph the dead at Antietam, and it was published. The dead of Antietam were published in the newspapers, and it was before the age of halftone, so they were accurate engravings. and it led to a massive spike in opposition to the war, a massive spike. The State Department, I don't know if it was, no one knows who implemented it, but following the dissemination of the death of Antietam in the most popular newspaper in the North, there was not another image that circulated in the Civil War until through the end of the war. And in every previous war, or every subsequent war rather, the government, whether it was World War I, Spanish-American War, World War II, there were no images of dead soldiers that circulated among the public, because they recognized if you tell the home front what war is about, and it's about killing people, and you show these images, people are not going to want to fight the war. And so that from the Battle of Antietam up until the Vietnam War, the home front did not see images of dead American soldiers. During World War II, there was one image that circulated in Harper's Magazine, for whatever reason, during Vietnam, a large number of politicians dropped the ball, and they essentially let journalists go into Vietnam, and it was a living room war. It was you turned the television on, and you were told the death toll of that day, and if there were photographs or film of dead soldiers, that was shown, and it, of course, that sends a message that war is about killing people, which is how and why the Vietnam War was so divisive. Yeah.
To go back to the taxation part, what does it take in a society where certain narratives are embedded to the degree that they are today here to make that kind of a fundamental shift to an entirely new set of possibilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in other words, what needs to happen for a narrative to change? That's a terrific question.
A narrative about the future, or about
Both the present and the future, and the narrative of a nation. That's a terrific question, and there's not a clear answer. So it depends upon a lot of contextual factors. So in some instances, the narrative changes because of a major famous political or cultural figure who helps to launch this narrative shift. In other cases, it doesn't work. It really depends. There are a number of different reasons how and why a narrative can suddenly shift. During war, it's easier for a narrative to shift. Both during war and in the immediate wake of war, it's easier to shift the narrative. In the absence of war, it's more difficult, and it requires a major figure, whether it's the president or it's someone who everyone recognizes, and is considered to be even if you dislike him or her, it's someone who is considered to be a major icon and with knowledge and an understanding of U.S. culture. So that's the best I can do, but it's a great question. There's not a clear answer for it. And that's also, I would say that's also true in the 19th century. The major, Emerson and especially Emerson, but also Thoreau. There were some major cultural figures whose influence was very narrow. And one of the one of many signal aspects of Lincoln was he was brilliant at creating a narrative and willing to change a narrative and to change his perspective based on who he's speaking to, and also based on what's happening during the war and even before the war. He had a brilliant sense of in the sense of public opinion.
But always playing on the association of national history with divine history, right?
Yes.
There's always the insinuation that there's something higher.
Yes. Which leads, which encourages religious, figures who see themselves as religious to share the narrative.
And leaders who are always in part prophets, right?
Yes, the prophets. So another example is Billy Graham, who is the evangelical minister. Billy Graham preached to not just more Americans. Billy Graham preached to more people than any other single person in the world, and transformed a number of societies outside of the United States. And he had a very open and loose understanding of faith, and he's one of the most influential figures in the 20th century, not just in the U.S. but in the rest of the world. And one is during the Cold War. Billy Graham went to Moscow, and there were 1 million people who came to listen to him. And his message was always very. It wasn't a political message. It was about one's relationship to God or Christ. And it was a very comforting, easy message. And he connected the individual with the nation or the world.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Just because you brought up Billy Graham, so now I'm thinking about religion. I'm wondering, and sorry, this doesn't really have to do with taxation, but since you brought up Billy Graham, is there a sense, in terms of narrative and narrative shift, it feels like it's been a bit hard for like the religious left to be a part of the national conversation in a way that the religious right has. And of course, it's not as easy as religious left, religious right, but just for the purpose of this conversation. And like, I'm even just thinking recently, like with ICE, like with the killings and with ICE recently. Oh my God, was it Minneapolis? Yeah. Like I have a number of friends who are clergy, and there was a huge call for clergy to go, to be on the streets to defend people, to stand with people. And I didn't see a lot of media coverage about it. I didn't hear a lot of people talking about it. And I guess I just feel like, oh, if the opposite happened, maybe it would be covered differently. And I'm just wondering from your perspectives, like with regards to narrative shift, like, do you have a sense of like why the Billy Grahams of America have been like so successful in shaping the narrative about religion in America? And it feels like, Reverend William Barber is a wonderful example of someone who is out there, right? And
Right.
but it doesn't feel the same in terms of how the American public
Right.
understands
Right.
the dynamic.
That's right. So one, that's a great these are a great. One is that I think I mentioned that there's been a fairly dramatic decline in religious faith in the United States since the 1980s. Billy Graham preached at a time in which the vast, something like 95%, or actually when Billy Graham was preaching, 98% of Americans said they believed in God without doubting the existence of God. And at that time, the number of people attending church or its equivalent regularly, meaning every other week or more, was like 89 or 90%. And so it was a period in which not just the U.S. but Europe was not nearly as religious as the United States, but South Korea, for example. South Korea, huge percentages of religiosity, which is one of the reasons why Billy Graham went there. So that was hugely influential. He understood the degree to which Americans and other places he went to. He actually did a lot of his own research, or had people identify, okay, what's the state of religion in this country I'm going to before I accept it. Within the United States, has more influential than virtually any other figure. And Graham, to his credit, did not have any clear political or religious ideologies. He was not the kind of minister who said, if you don't do X, you're not a true Christian. It's like anyone who has any degree, actually even if you don't have a degree of faith, he wants to bring you to God and Jesus. And it doesn't matter, for Graham it didn't matter what denomination or what church you were in, period. He wanted, he hoped that people would in the sense, come to Jesus, come to God on their own, but encouraged him. And I think I mentioned that a number of scholars say that Billy Graham helped to evangelize South Vietnam because he went there for 3 different trips. So Billy Graham his message was very simple. He was a brilliant orator. He recognized the power of music. He enlisted both adults and high school students to be part of the choir. Music was a big part of his sermons, which attracted a lot of people. He had a brilliant sense of who his audience was, and made his audiences feel comfortable about themselves and feel as though they were right with And I can send you some of his speeches. they're brilliant. As works of oratory, they truly are brilliant. Especially to a broad audience, some of whom are intellectuals, most of whom are just people from, a regular person. And so it's a testament to the power of oratory, the power of speech, the power of words. And he recognized that. And he also very much as I said before, he went someplace, he wanted to know what the culture was like. I mean, he was born in the South. He was a Southerner. He was a deep Southerner. In fact, he established his ministry in Minnesota because he didn't want to be pegged as another Southern preacher. He wanted to be. He wanted to transcend being I'm just another Southern preacher. He wanted to be a global preacher, and that was a mission early on. And he practiced. He would practice his speeches in front of a mirror. I mean, it was truly he was the best way to describe Billy Graham is that he was a religious minister, but he's also a brilliant actor. He was a brilliant actor, and I say that not in a negative way. He was a genuine actor, but he took he asked advice from major leading actors themselves, because he recognized the power of words. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I mean,
and
yes.
It didn't matter, it didn't matter what your denomination, what your faith was. He encouraged people to get close to have a relationship with God or the Almighty. And who that was could be, it was pretty broad.
Well, I guess I'm thinking what's always fascinated me is the history of progressive religion in America, and if I find that in conversations, where two people or a group of people disagree about a moral position or a political position, there's almost like it's not happening on a religion, because I feel like so often the religious left, or like the idea that religion could be on the side of progressive issues, it's not recognized as much in American public life. And so then I find that really hard conversations end up not happening on the sort of religious rhetoric field. It kind of drives me crazy, because I feel like it's actually a really helpful way to see the other person.
Yes, that's true.
And I think it's one of the most important things that we need to change the narrative of the country, to hold the democracy together. So that's why I ask, because it is such a rich part of American history. It's just almost like we just don't know our own history.
Right.
I mean, I guess that's a problem in this country on
but
many
it
fronts.
goes back to the tensions between Boston, between the Quakers and the Boston, or the early church in North America. There were huge feuds, and there were a lot throughout. And that's part of the power of Graham, is he refused to say I'm this kind of minister. It's like I want to reach everyone without saying, if you're not he despised specific denominations. It was simply about one's relationship with God. And that's what made him so popular, and along with his oratory and his and he genuinely met with a large number of people. I think I mentioned he would hire teenagers to sort of be in the choir, which is that's hugely, that's a major event for like a 15-year-old or 18-year-old to go to another country and sing in the choir for a long time, for every day for a number. It's a way of, it made both children and adults feel better about themselves and help them become closer to their God. But there's also been, as you point out, a hugely divisive, almost warlike relationship between different religious groups, which has been, in my view, devastating. And Graham recognized that, and self-consciously sought to treat everyone as an equal, regardless of what your own individual church or faith is. I mean, he was almost sui generis. He's probably one of the most influential figures in the 20th century. Yes.
Potentially bridging the gap between the narrative shift and also talking about, I would frame it almost as majoritarian and non-majoritarian perspectives. Can you talk about Frederick Douglass some with doing this, particularly with his
Frederick
oratory?
Douglass?
Yes, yeah. Because I think
talk about
especially,
Frederick Douglass all
yeah,
day.
and like especially with like every bit of his use of religious language and
Yes.
going back to, I mean, talk about somebody creating change and shifting,
Yes.
changing hearts and minds, all of it.
Yes.
In times that seem like, and from a position, I guess, that seems so just insurmountable.
Yeah, so Douglass was, I mean, as you probably know, he had no formal education. He was, in my view, Douglass was so Douglass he's best known as an orator. And in fact, he spoke to more Americans in the 19th century than any other single figure, with the possible exception of Mark Twain. His oratory was unmatched. If you haven't read any of Douglass's speeches, he stands apart from literally every other orator or writer as a nonfiction writer. And Douglass was deeply religious. In fact, but he doesn't wear it on his sleeve. I mean, almost all of his speeches are speeches. In fact, all of his speeches are speeches advocating, demanding both freedom and equality. Period. That was the centrality of his message, and he was truly brilliant at including specific instances that had occurred. I mean, he preached from both during, before the war as well as after the war, and continued to expose the hypocrisy of Southerners, and his aim was to try to essentially, it was religious, try to convert people to recognize the equality of blacks and women, of indigenous, but especially of blacks and women, as equals. And he, in a sense, you could connect Douglass with Billy Graham, and that Douglass also had a brilliant sense of who his audience was. In fact, he would do everything he could to find out how large the crowd was, who they were, were they all fellow abolitionists, were they non-abolitionists, who were they? And he gauged and geared his speeches toward his audience. He also published a lot of his speeches, which then circulated. And so he would speak to maybe 500 or 1,000, and then the speeches were circulated as pamphlets. So he achieved even wider scope. And his major theme was that in the United States, in a democracy, it was about the crucial significance of freedom and especially of equal rights under the law for all, regardless of who you are. He was he called out especially politicians who opposed that. But virtually, there were a large number of, both before the Civil War and after, of conservatives who went to hear him speak just because it was so powerful. But he also, in the process, converted a lot of people into the abolition cause before the war and into, after the war, an egalitarian system. I mean, he was hamstrung after the war because Southerners essentially went from chattel slavery to serfdom, and Douglass gave a talk in Nashville, Tennessee, which is a border state, but there was an attempt on his life when he was there. After the war, Douglass would have been lynched had he spent any time in the South. So it was mostly the North. But he also lectured, gave speech. I mean, he was a rock star in England. And England was, at that time, both in the 1840s and after the war, he went to England. He almost stayed in England and returned to the United States in the antebellum period because he wanted to. He had a sense of obligation to his fellow blacks to help destroy slavery. But Brits adored him. I mean, he would give speeches in Britain, and there'd be 3,000 people there. And Brits had at that time a much more nuanced understanding of great oratory. In fact, American writers sought to publish something that would be celebrated by Britain. If you could write like a British, that was a huge crown for you. But Douglass was, I mean, in a sense, like Billy Graham, Douglass, he invokes religion in virtually every speech he gives. It's a good question. Is there any other questions? You have anything else you want to add?
No?
I actually don't have. What time is it?
It's almost 2:30. I think this conversation is different from the ones we've had before.
Yeah.
We're coming closer to the essence.
Yes. Roberta, we're coming closer to the essence. The other thing I would say is that connects Douglass and Billy Graham is especially Douglass, recognized the fragility of a fragility of a democratic society. That it requires one to accept the will of the majority within a democracy, and not to try to overthrow it. And that in a democratic society, in theory, each person has an equal voice and an equal vote, even if what they stand for is horrific to others. But a sense of respect for what someone stands for, regardless of whether you accept it, and allow the voice to disseminate rather than shut it down. That a central theme of democracy is that, except for, it doesn't become common in until the 20th century, is pornography. Essentially, pornography really doesn't. Technically, it exists in photography in the 19th century, but it doesn't circulate. That's a central theme to these major figures, is the recognition that that Douglas or Billy Graham would speak to audiences and realize that some of the people in the audience were totally antithetical to their entire worldview and values. But part of the point is to convert them, and they had to accept